Welcome to the first steps of setting in our first painting. We already talked about the materials. You'll see my palette is set up. I have a full range of color. You have that primary yellow, primary red, primary blue. You have the brown and you have ink. You possibly bought some of the other colors. It may be light violet, the transparent orange, the Indian yellow, Prussian blue, teal, ultramarine. So those are some of those optional colors. And if I use an optional color, I'll say so. So now we have our reference. Ideally, we would have gone out, taken some photos, and you'd remember what this feels like. We're working from a photo for the sake of this class, so ideally, please know that anytime I'm actually working, I've gone to the place, I've taken a bunch of photos. I literally probably have a couple thousand photos in vinyl tubs that are in the basement and behind me piled in each other. So after looking through, I chose this photo. It's a pretty good photo. It's already got a nice composition. I've taped it off to equal the ratio of the canvas board I'm working on. You might choose to practice if you'd like. If you want to just try a quick sort of 30-minute go over, you might want to work on a piece of the canvas paper if that would make you feel more comfortable. So, laying in the sketch. You've already done one or two or three preparatory sketches just to get a sense of the composition. You could have done those in charcoal or pencil. This one was pencil. So now I'm going to put the sketchbook back. I've got my photo. I already put the ground on the canvas. Remember, we put a ground on in that first synchronous meeting. Ground meaning predominantly medium, and the one that I recommended was the gloss medium and varnish. So you're using the suspension of acrylic paint with a little bit of pigment in it just to get rid of the white, to set a foundation of color. This is a soft sort of brick orange. You could have done a pale yellow. You could have done a really brilliant. So for example, there's one that's a little bit brighter that I'm getting ready to start into. And sometimes I do an extremely saturated. So as we move through and you do more paintings, you'll get a sense, what do you like as that foundation ground, that color that you start with? You can put your sketch onto this board very lightly. We're not putting value. You can use a charcoal pencil. You can use a soft lead pencil and just get your basic line sketch in place. And again, if I was doing that, and I can sort of figure out here that it's, I could measure if I want, but it's slightly below center, so where I started that would work. And you can lay that sketch in, and I see that there's a little cut into the edge of the bank right there where you can see some dirt and a rock that comes in. Notice I'm not laying out, I'm not worrying about getting a great deal of detail. I'm just trying to set in that basic composition. So charcoal, pencil, or what I'm going to do, I tend to just, if you're more comfortable, you can tape that photo on your easel. You can keep it next to where you're working. If I'm working on a big painting on the Greenwich easel, which is behind me, often I'll have 3 or 4 or 5 of those photos just sort of taped off to the side to use as reference. And we're just starting, so you'll probably be a little more attached to this photo. But as you work more, you begin to realize that the notes you take when you're out on site, the sketches, the photos, they're reference. And you'll start relying more and more on what you remember, what you recall that sensation is. If we were doing this in a more plein air approach, we would actually go out, do a pencil sketch, and maybe 2 or 3 small, not on canvas, but on board, a couple little studies in loose, quick color, and bring all that back to the studio. So you're trying to capture how it felt, how you remember that experience. So now I'm going to work in paint. That's how I go into my canvas. You do not have to. You could have laid that whole sketch in pencil. So let's pretend you have your sketch in pencil. And then, sorry. So remember I'd said if it's cooler in the winter, I do wear a smock, which makes it easier. In the summer, I had to turn the air off down here so it wasn't as noisy. So it's a little stuffy, but I always make sure I have a towel on my lap since I tend to spill paint. I mean, I'm wearing crappy clothes. Don't wear nice stuff when you're painting, but it's still a good idea to have a towel or something in your lap. Now I'm sitting because I'm working on a small painting. Ideally, anything pretty much over this scale, I stand. So I have this table easel, and then I have a Greenwich easel sort of diagonally behind me, and I have another one that's just stored. And there have been times when I've had two large canvases that I'm working simultaneously. When I'm working on those, I stand. The reason you stand generally to paint is that idea of being able to very quickly and loosely move back and forth, so you're getting a view of the piece from not just the same distance. Again, so for this painting, I'm sitting here at a Greenwich easel, which will slightly limit my ability to move, but we're going to work in smaller increments. Okay, so let me get this sketch in. I'm going to try to talk while I'm doing it, but perhaps a lot of what is going to be happening is by just watching and then thinking about how you're going to do it, or watching first and then playing it back. So I'm going to take a little bit of that. So I took my brown, and I'm going to try to work with those colors you have first. Took a little bit of that primary blue. I've got a nice sort of dark. I want this to be a bit more organic. So now I'm going to grab a color you don't have. So I tend to like that quinacridone burnt orange, which is sort of a transparent reddish color. So I just grab some of that. My medium is on the palette, so I'm just going to go over and I'm grabbing a couple brush loads. I have the glazing liquid mixed through my palette, and actually before I turned on the camera, and I should have waited, I put a little bit of the gloss medium and varnish, just a dab of it, a little dollop of it on my palette. So I mixed the two together for this because I'm not going to be working this for very long. So I'm looking at mine. I already started working in that sketch. But what I want to do is I'm going to just very loosely try to figure out. So I'm looking at this with my eye is careful, and I'm trying to think of how irregular. I don't want this to look like it's a machine. By the way, the bottom, when it sits on a shelf, sometimes that's a pain. I just have a slightly thinner piece of wood I keep, and sometimes I use that because I'm less likely to have that funny little halo at the bottom. So all I'm doing now is I'm looking, and I'm rolling this brush around. I'm not gripping it like it's some kind of a pencil or a weapon. And I'm just moving it around because I can see what's going to be happening in that part of the image is all of that the light that is just sort of dappled down through there. So I just worked in where that basic diagonal of the foreground edge of the creek is. And then I'm going to say, okay, so I'm just getting some basic, and I can look back and see that the shore that's back here is almost blocked, but it's absolutely not regular either. So there's a little bit of variation in it. And then I can come up, and I took the photo, so normally you'd have reference and you'd know what was there. There's actually some houses back there. I don't want the houses. I mean, I can barely see roof lines, but I'm ignoring those. So I'm going to just suggest, again, where that tree line would be in the back. And because I'm going to take another, I already used all of that gloss medium, so I'm putting a little more down. Remember, the gloss medium dries quickly. You can use it as a medium with your brush. The glazing liquid dries slowly. Since I know I'm doing this loose sketch in the back, I don't need this to dry real slowly. That's why I'm mixing and using much more of the gloss medium than the glazing liquid. Glazing liquid slow when you want to blend. Gloss medium, faster dry, when that blend isn't quite as necessary. I see that that middle ground shore, the back edge of this creek is a little darker. So I'm just going to go ahead. I just dipped in some ink and I'm just going to pull some dark into this sketch that I have in place. So I need to put that photo down. I don't know if the photo's showing up on the camera, but I can glance over at it for reference. Once again, do not worry if you feel like you are more attached to the photo right now. I'm probably a little less attached. I'm getting reference from it, but I'm not feeling like I have to be copying it. So now I've established what would be the horizon line. You've got a tree line back there. I've got the foreground shore. I'm going to set in the value for the sky before I begin to work in the other detail. Generally, you want to think back to front, because you're trying to create the illusion of depth. So what you're painting, if you're painting the back first, everything you're placing on top of it is literally supposed to be moving closer to us. So I was using a big flat to do that, and I could have used a round. And I've got a ton of brushes. You have an assortment. If you've been painting for a while, you probably have quite a few. If you're just starting, you might only have 4 or 5. But I tend to like, I'm sorry, I'm reaching off camera again, but I'm digging through my big pile. So I'll grab a couple that are nice, a variety of sizes. So I just grabbed 2. These are called scripts or riggers. I've been using these a lot, so they're starting to lose their point, but when they're wet, you can see it's a tall, thin bristle. I know I'm going to be working with these when I get to that tree, so I just pulled some of those over here for now. I'm going to put the sky in, so I'm grabbing another big flat. I'm going to take a fair amount of white. The white we have is titanium, and I didn't put, there is a transparent white. I didn't put any on my palette so that I don't get in the habit of trying to use something that I know you don't have. Transparent white works well, if you're blending. This opaque titanium white works particularly well when you want a color to cover. And I have a pretty brilliant sky. The sky in this is a little bit duller, so I've decided I want to pull it into, I want it to be a bit more blue. So I have all kinds of photo reference, and those are a little farther away. I had thought about this one, which I like, the sky, but then I went, well, it doesn't matter if it's going to get buried in the trees, so I want the effect then of a slightly more saturated blue. You get to make those decisions. So I grab my palette knife because I don't necessarily want to pollute that primary blue that I have. And I pulled some over, and I could, if I was actually being correct, I would do the blend. So there's what the palette knife is actually for, is so I can blend that color and get a nice, if anybody's worked with a mortar, it's almost like to paint what a mortar is to herbs or cooking. So that blue isn't quite as brilliant as the blue that is over there in my second reference, but it's definitely got a little more life than in the photo, and that's what I want. So I forgot that I had that little, so I just pulled that back out. I'm using pretty thick paint because in this case, I actually want it to go down pretty opaque. I don't really want to worry about any kind of semi-transparency at this point. So without much medium in it, it's going to be much more covering, much more of an opaque surface. So I just get that basic sky in there. I know that the tree line that's back there is irregular, so I'm going to just take my brush. I'm picking up some of that brown, but I'm not. Again, I don't stress this stuff because this is a layered approach. So I know that this isn't my last go at this particular area. Okay, so I've got a sky and I'm pretty happy with that. I've got this color in my brush and I figure, well, why waste it? I know that water is going to have some sky in it, and even though I'm setting in this underpainting, this foundation layer, I'm going to use what I have on my brush. When I look at that water and just think about it, you have an irregular plane, that's going to the edge, it's dropping off. The water is planar, so you actually have a receding horizontal surface. So one of the tricks to water, and part of why we're doing this painting, is it was almost an even tie, but I figured we'll take the challenge of water right off the table and do that first. So that's one of the reasons that I figured, well, let's just go for it. Water is hard, a little trick. So I'm gonna just start to suggest where I know eventually that sky is gonna show up. And if you notice, I'm using strokes from the very beginning that are going in the direction that the ripples on the water, the surface of the water would be using. And I'm not trying to finish this painting. I'm just setting in a foundation, and we'll see in a second how these are gonna get lost. And I also see on the painting, it gets a little bit brighter over here, so I put a little bit more white in. And all I'm doing is getting some of that. It's on my palette. I know I'm gonna use it, so I'll get a little bit of it in place. And as I said, I'm not even thinking about trying to finish this painting. So don't second guess yourself and begin attacking your ability immediately, like, oh my God, this is so bad. Okay, just try to look at what you're working with and make strokes that reflect the material, the texture, and keep thinking. Water is planar. Unless we were painting a mesa in the Southwest, the landscape we're used to is absolutely very rarely planar. It tends to have a lot of texture and curves and topography to it. So there's a lot of not sort of smooth planar kind of lines. So when you have water present, you know you're going to be thinking, okay, my brush work is going to be flowing with that surface of the water, which tends to be a single direction in terms of being horizontal. Okay, so now I've got that in there. I've got this blue on my brush. It's a tint. If I mix it with anything, I'm going to make a tone. So I'm looking and I see that there's brilliant sort of mossy greens in that water. So I'm just going to, while I'm here, I've got that blue. I'm lifting some of that neutral that I used, the dark brown that I used to do the underpainting, the sketch itself. I'm going to lift a little bit more medium into that. Oops. And I'm going to go over, I'll use what you have. This is actually where I would use green gold, an absolutely wonderful color. So first I'm going to use what you have to show you. So I'll take some of the primary yellow, and it shouldn't be polluting all my color. I'll take some of the primary blue. Because I've got this color on my brush already, I should be getting a neutral. And it's far too blue. Oh, yuck. Much, much, much bluer than I want it. The advantage of the green gold is it is transparent and it leans very, very, very warm, meaning a lot of yellow. So I'm going to put more of that primary yellow back in there. And now that's getting to be a little bit more, a little warmer. Not loving it, but it is warmer. Take some of that brown into it, because in the water it's already been dirtied. Water has reflection. It has the material that is actually the aggregate that's in the water, plus it has whatever is the bottom, whatever makes up the base of the water. So I just ended up with a neutral I'm not loving very much, but I'm going to show you the difference. So I'm going to put some of this, I'm going to just loosely brush it in there just to start getting a ground in. Now I'm going to show you the difference. If you want to buy one color, buy the green gold. So I just took a brushlet of green gold down here. And I'm going to use that. I'm going to touch a little bit of that primary yellow back into it. And I'm going to come up here with that color. Now I don't know if you can see, but it's much more alive. So I just went right through what's there. And again, I'm not finishing the painting. Just trying to use some of what I have and begin to set in the basic foundation. So now I have that green gold, and didn't bring over the tubes, but I don't know if you can read that, but there's the green gold. It's a golden color. I don't know if they have that name color in Liquitex, but I know they have an equivalent color in Liquitex. Since I have this green, and I'm looking at that, what's going on behind the green of the tree, and there's a little bit of a challenge because we have foreground green and we have background green. When color recedes, the way we perceive it, it dulls, and there's two primary ways that you can dull color. One is by adding anything that is a tint or a shade. So that means white, black, or a combination of white and black added to something. White tints it, black shades it, white and black tones it. Or you can put a tiny bit of its complement in, which dulls the volume of the color. So this is green. Green is made up of yellow and blue, so I'm going to just take a little bit of my primary red. Let me grab another. So I'm just going to take a little of that primary red, put it up there. I've got that color that's in my brush. I had a feeling that would be too much, so I put a whole lot of that red over, but that's a nice sort of dull color. I'm letting a little of that brown I used get into it. And right now it's a bit of a sort of dulled, almost a camouflagey kind of green, or definitely a transitional autumn kind of green. And all I'm doing is taking that color and I'm setting it in the back there because I know my tree line. And I can do the inverse I did when I did the sky if I want to just let that have a slightly irregular edge for now, because I know that it's going to be read through dense foliage through that foreground tree. So as a result, I'm not right now worried about whether I'm seeing a great deal of specific sharp focus tree line edge. When I look at the, as it gets closer to the shore, I can tell there's a lot more brush down there. So since it's still on my palette and it still hasn't dried, I'm just going right up to that, the brown that I had mixed, and I'm going to dip into the ink. My brush won't fit in the ink, so I go over to the one I have on the palette. So I have that darker brown. This leaves a little cool. It's that same color that I just used for the green above, just slightly darkened with brown. And I'm just going to feather it a little bit at that edge. So I'll keep saying it. I'm not trying to finish this painting in this first go. So we're not doing plein air where you go out on site and the goal is you finish a painting in 1 hour or 2 hours. I'm building this painting up in layers. So now I have the start. I went back sky. I moved in front of it and established where there's going to be this basic tree line. Below the tree line, as it gets closer to the water, there's a lot of roots, and that edge has a little bit of the dirt and where it sort of cuts into the water. So I'm letting all of that show. I have this color on my brush. I'm coming back down to that green gold color I used for the reflection of the water. And I just mixed the two together. So I'm going to come up to that edge and let that slightly muddier, slightly darker green fill in that edge for now. So at this point, I'm going to put that brush. I'm looking, take it back. I see that there is grass on the foreground. So I'm going to go back over. I'm going to grab some of the primary cyan, the blue. And I'm going to mix it with some of that primary yellow. And for now, I'm not going to stress this too much, but I know there's going to be grass down there, so I'm using the brush in strokes that are sort of going up and down, because I know that what's going to be along that shore is going to be clumps of grass, and those clumps of grass are going to be mixed in with dirt. So again, I'm not necessarily making this solid green, but I'm just going through and getting some of that in. So now, at this point, I will put the brush into the water, and we're just going to lay the rest of where that tree is, and that's going to be sort of the first step that I would recommend, and that'll take you, 45 minutes to an hour when you're working through that. So I know there's some dark value along that edge. I'm going to come back to my brown. And I'm still using where I've been mixing it on my palette. I'm grabbing some of that combination I still have on my palette of the gloss medium and the glazing liquid, because at this point, again, I don't need this to dry real slowly. I just dipped a brush into the ink. I have a nice dark. And all I'm doing is I'm going to just clarify that this is actually going to be where I see a side section of the cut where there's a sort of muddy out bank where part of it goes out and the other has been cut in. And then while I'm at it, I know that the water down here, I can see it has reflections. So I've got that on my brush, and all I'm doing, once again, not trying to finish the painting, I'm just pulling that value right through that hint of the water that I already put in place. And I can look at my brush or my photo reference and see that that is highly irregular, the reflections in the water. So all I'm doing now is using that dark on my brush to get some of that. So I just switched back to my little board to get some of that water reflection just begin, so that I know there's going to be a lot of dark that shows up in that foreground. I'm going to reach and get more medium because I feel my brush dragging. And in this case, I don't need my brush dragging. So I see there's definitely a lot of that dark that's going to be down there because it's the reflections of the tree that we haven't put in yet, but it's going to overhang the water. So all I'm doing is just beginning to suggest, looking at that photo, where some of those are going to fit. And at some point it's going to be a broken record. I apologize, but I'm not trying to finish the painting. One of the hardest things is that I find that people in their painting get so impatient and start like attacking what they're doing themselves, saying, oh my gosh, this doesn't look at all like what's happening. Well, we're working in steps and we're building this up in layers. So I hope it doesn't look like exactly what's there, because I'm not sure how you would have done that even if you were a speed painter. Taking a little more of that brown, taking a tiny bit of the white, because I can see that there's a lot of dirt that shows up. I might as well just suggest that before I get up into that tree. That's a pretty cool color, and the reality is this is really warm. You have red, yellow, and blue. So I would actually either mix a little of the red and a lot of the yellow and make an orange to mix with this, or I already have a transparent orange as one of those optional colors. I just mixed a little of that in. I'm going to grab a little bit of white again. And this is not going to be as light as the highlight, but it's going to allow me to start suggesting. I've been working all with this one brush. I can actually take this brush to the side. This is called Scumbling. And I can just loosely pull that, drag it through some of that color that I already have in place, so that I know this is going to be an irregular kind of, this is a nice groomed lawn feel. Instead, this is going to have a combination of clumps of grass mixed in through a lot of dirt and mud that's still showing. Okay, so now we're going to put that tree in, or just suggest that tree. And at that point, I'm going to turn this first step off and give you a little breather. So I grabbed one of those long, thin brushes. The ones I said are called scripts. The old term for it used to be rigger. This one, you can see I even have it taped shut because I've broken it, because sometimes I don't realize I'm gripping too tightly, which is a bad thing. Don't grip too tightly. So I've got this one crappy old like junker brush. I can even see that the top head is ready to fall off, and then I have a much nicer new one that I haven't abused as much yet. So I'll take that old one for now. I'm going to take a lot of that brown, and I'm going to take a couple brushfuls of ink. And I could do